History records a silence in the Irish countryside that was savage beyond belief. Not a peaceful silence, not the silence of a Sunday morning or a field resting between seasons. This was the silence of absence, the silence of a place where children had been and weren't anymore, where neighbors had called to each other across stone walls and no longer did. It settled over Connacht and Munster and Clare like something physical, like a hand pressed over a mouth. It wasn't just the silence of the dead, it was the sound of a civilized nation watching millions starve, while their mouths were stained green from eating grass. They ate grass because the human body in its desperation will attempt almost anything before it surrenders. The grass gave the sensation of a full stomach, while the body continued to hollow out. They were dying full. That detail is not incidental. It is the whole story in miniature. But on the nearby docks, in Limerick, in Cork, in Westport, a different sound echoed. The rhythmic thud of crates being loaded onto ships. 12 barrels of salted butter, 500 sacks of grain, cattle driven in groups up the gangplanks, lowing in the grey morning. All of it leaving ports where the people were dying of hunger. Some of the dock workers loading those ships had family members a few miles inland who would not survive the winter. They loaded the ships anyway, because refusing meant losing the day's wage, and the day's wage was the margin between their children living and dying. This wasn't an act of God. It was a calculating machinery of death, one with paperwork and shipping manifests, and men in London offices who reviewed the figures and signed off on them. We often think of the Irish famine as a natural disaster, a tragedy defined by a failed potato crop, a chapter of political history that belongs to botany and bad luck. The blight was real. Phytophthora infestans, the water mold that destroyed the potato across Europe in the 1840s, was not invented by anyone. It was not ordered. It arrived. But a crop failure does not become a million deaths by itself. Between the blight and the body count, there were choices. Specific, deliberate, documented choices made by specific men with names and salaries and career ambitions. The unsanitized reality of the Great Famine is not a story about botany. It is a study of how a human being or an entire empire can maintain undisputed power by wearing a mask of divine favor and humanitarian truth. In the next 15 minutes, we are stripping away the sanitized legends. You are going to discover how the British Empire used economic theory and accounting as a legal trap to turn a tragedy into a private battlefield of survival. We will see how human beings were catalogued, rationed, and destroyed with the same indifference a factory owner applies to a broken machine. We will watch as the men responsible for those decisions wrote letters to each other describing those decisions as mercy. This is the story of rational violence, violence in service of a spreadsheet. Because the machinery used in 1845, the machinery of noble language wrapped around profitable violence, is still running today. To understand the horror, we must first look at the invisible people. In the mid-19th century, the Irish peasant occupied the bottom of a psychological architecture designed to keep them there. Like every architecture of power, this one required a story, a narrative that explained why the people at the bottom deserved to be there. London newspapers provided that narrative with enthusiasm. The Irish were written about with a mixture of scientific curiosity and open condescension, described as improvident, emotional, congenitally incapable of the discipline that English civilization required. Cartoons in publications like Punch depicted them as primitive, as children who needed managing. The language was not hidden or shameful. It was mainstream. It was the water everyone swam in. This matters because it tells us how power sustains itself before it uses force. First, it renders its target legible as lesser. The Irish didn't lose their humanity in a single declaration. It was taken incrementally, through language, through caricature, through the gentle accumulation of 1,000 newspaper columns that all agreed these are not quite like us. They were the invisible population, the ones whose disappearances were mourned in silence, because the families mourning them had no voice and no recourse against the system. When a family buried a child beside their cottage, sometimes without a coffin, sometimes without a priest, because the priest was also sick, there was no inquest, no official record. They vanished without documentation, which is one of the ways the powerful ensure the powerless cannot be accurately counted, and therefore cannot be fully mourned. When the blight hit the potato crops beginning in the autumn of 1845, it wasn't just a biological failure. It was the moment the rules stopped applying for the poor. The British administration didn't see a grieving nation. They saw a property portfolio that needed reform, and the language of reform was already waiting, fully formed. The British didn't respond with an army of doctors. They responded with a theatre of civilization. The official purpose of their policy was improvement. They called it laissez-faire, the noble language of the free market. Let prices find their natural level. Let the market correct itself. Do not interfere with the sacred mechanism of trade. It was the dominant economic doctrine of the age, endorsed by the leading political economists at Oxford and Edinburgh, and its champions believed in it with the conviction of men who had never personally gone hungry. The intellectual framework had a specific shape. Drawing from writers like Thomas Malthus, British administrators argued that famine was, in a grim and mathematical sense, corrective, that populations which outgrew their food supply were being naturally disciplined. Suffering, in this view, was not a problem to be solved. It was a lesson being administered. The role of government was not to interrupt the lesson. But notice how the word free is used here. Free market, free trade, free state. The same word Leopold II would later attach to the Congo, placed there deliberately like a signature on a forgery. Freedom in these constructions does not mean freedom for the people inside the system. It means freedom for the system itself, freedom from accountability, freedom from interruption, freedom from the inconvenient fact of human suffering. Under the mask of this economic theory, the government argued that intervening to feed the hungry would damage the market, that distributing food aid would undermine local prices and discourage future agricultural investment, that the Irish needed to learn, through suffering, the habits of self-reliance that civilization required. Think about the audacity. Do you tell a mother whose child is visibly starving, whose body is consuming itself, that you cannot help her because it would upset the balance of trade? The answer is, you don't tell her directly. You never speak to her at all. You write a memorandum. You cite a principle. You trust that the principle is respectable enough, and the mother obscure enough that the gap between them will never have to be explained. Like the shipping clerk, Edmund Morel, who realized something was profoundly wrong by reading manifests, noticing that ships going into the Congo carried weapons and came out carrying rubber, with no wages anywhere in between. We must look at the logs of the 1840s, because the logs tell a story the speeches do not. During the worst years of the famine, 1846 and 1847, the years the Irish called Black 47, ships were leaving Ireland loaded with food, butter, livestock, oats, barley, wheat, all destined for English tables, for English breakfast tables, while in Skibbereen and Castlebar and Ballinrobe, people were being found dead in their own doorways. The specific numbers are documented. In the 12 months following the second crop failure, tens of thousands of tons of grain were exported during the same period that relief officials in London were still debating whether food aid would create dependency. Cattle and sheep departed Irish ports in the weeks when the roads to workhouses were lined with those who had not survived the walk. While the screaming forests of the Congo were bleeding rubber, the green fields of Ireland were bleeding calories for export. What the world described as trade was, in the language of balance sheets, theft through administrative indifference. The food wasn't being shared. It was being extracted, protected, in transit, by the same crown forces that evicted families who couldn't pay rent on land they had worked for generations. Every barrel of butter shipped out of Cork was an itemized receipt of a life that could have been saved. Not metaphorically. Literally, the calories existed. The ships existed. The distance between an Irish port and an Irish mouth was not a logistical problem. It was a political decision, one that was made explicitly every morning by men who signed their names to it. The men who ran the famine relief were not lawless bandits. That is the most important thing to understand about them. They were not cruel in the way a bully is cruel, impulsive, unthinking, driven by rage. They were articulate. They were charming in company. They corresponded in elegant prose and attended church on Sunday mornings, and believed with perfect sincerity that they were doing what God and history required of them. Charles Edward Trevelyan, the man most directly responsible for administering British relief during the famine, was by all contemporary accounts brilliant, energetic, and relentlessly hard-working. He had served with distinction in India and written extensively on public administration. He was not a fringe figure. He was trusted, promoted, and eventually knighted for his service. In his private correspondence, Trevelyan described the famine as a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, a judgment delivered by God upon a people who had grown dependent upon a single crop and needed to be corrected. He was not performing this belief for a public audience. He wrote it in letters that were never intended to be published. This was what he actually thought. That is the specific horror at the center of this story. Not the cruelty of a monster, which we could understand and contain. The cruelty of a believer. Man who had so thoroughly merged his professional interest with his moral identity that he experienced the death of 1 million people as confirmation that he was right. His certainty was not a weakness in the system. It was a feature. The system selected for men like him precisely because their certainty made them effective. He used terror as a reliable management tool. If a starving family couldn't pay rent, and of course they couldn't, because they had no income, because the crop that sustained them had failed, they were evicted. Their homes were unroofed. Unroofing was a specific practice. The landlord's agents would arrive, sometimes with constables, and physically dismantle the roof of the cottage, pulling down thatch, breaking rafters, so that the structure could never be inhabited again. In the Irish West in February, with the Atlantic wind driving horizontal rain off the ocean, this was a sentence. The family would stand in what had been their home and watch the sky open above them. Some wandered to the nearest road and died there. Some made it to a workhouse, where conditions were specifically designed to be worse than anything outside, because the philosophy of the workhouse was that only the truly desperate should enter, and misery was the filter. Some, a very few, found passage on a ship. This wasn't mindless madness. It was bureaucratically organized evil. It had forms. It had procedures. It had men with the official title of relieving officer, whose actual function was to determine who was desperate enough to qualify for bare minimum assistance, and to ensure that minimum stayed minimal enough not to disturb the market. The real horror isn't just the 1 million ghosts, though 1 million is a number so large the mind reaches for it and retreats. 1 million is not a statistic you can hold. You can only approach it from below. One family in a field, one child buried beside a cottage wall, one woman walking to a workhouse with 2 living children and arriving with 1. Then repeat that in every county, in every winter, until you have counted to 1 million. The real lesson is the mechanism. And the mechanism is this: ordinary bureaucratic structures, operated by educated and self-respecting men, following coherent intellectual frameworks endorsed by the leading minds of the age, can produce outcomes indistinguishable from deliberate mass murder. And the men inside the structure will never need to understand themselves as murderers. They will understand themselves as administrators, as realists, as the ones willing to make difficult decisions that the sentimental could not face. We want to believe this was a singular aberration, a rabid animal of history that can be named and caged and treated as an exception. But the evidence will not support that comfort. The famine shows us what happens when the structures meant to check power, journalism, diplomacy, and law are captured by the people that power belongs to. The journalists who wrote sympathetically about the famine were Irish with small circulations and less influence. The journalists who set the tone in London accepted the framework they were given: economic necessity, Irish improvidence, the regrettable but inevitable consequences of natural law. The law itself was administered by men like Trevelyan, whose professional identity was inseparable from the policies they enforced. There was no outside. The machinery was total. Ultimate cruelty does not announce itself with fangs. It does not arrive with a declaration of malice or a uniform marked with the word enemy. It arrives with a development plan and a press release. It arrives as the man everyone trusts, the efficient administrator, the careful steward of public resources, the voice of reason in a room full of sentiment, performing exactly the role the system needs him to perform. In 1847, the system needed a way to prioritize profit over life, and then described that choice as economic necessity. It needed men who could look at a shipping manifest, food leaving a starving country, and describe what they saw as a functioning market. And it found those men. It always finds those men, because the system selects for them, rewards them, promotes them, and later writes their biographies with admiration. The history we think we know is often just a mask for a much darker, more human reality. Leopold II built a throne of rubber. The British administration in Ireland built a throne of laissez-faire. Both called it progress. Both were sustained by the same mechanism, a language of civilization elegant enough to make the violence inside it invisible to the people who chose not to look. The question is not how one man or one government could do this. The question is how many people had to look away for them to keep doing it. How many shipping clerks noted the manifests and said nothing? How many members of Parliament received the reports from Ireland and returned to their dinners? How many readers in London consumed columns about Irish improvidence and felt, not guilt, but quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of a worldview confirmed? But it is the only one worth sitting with. Because the machinery doesn't stop when the crisis ends, it waits. If this journey into the unsanitized reality of the Great Famine gave you a new perspective, hit the subscribe button. Next, you need to watch the story of the real Tamerlane, another architect of the macabre who built his empire on bone and called his methods divine will. The patterns are different, but the mechanism is the same. I will see you in the next investigation.